Okay, hello. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us this Friday. Tonight's webinar will focus on Lamas and specifically on succession rights and rent increases. Tonight, we have a special presenter who has been working with Palante for years, tenant attorney David Hershey Webb. He will be discussing on this topic, and then we will answer all the questions you have. Please do drop questions in our Q&A box. Tonight, however, we will not have interpretation tonight because our interpreter was unavailable, but we will get it re-recorded in Spanish, so just look out for that. But as of right now, people are still joining in, but I'm gonna have David introduce himself and we can start talking about the topic tonight. Go ahead, David.
Good evening. All right, thank you, Jakari. And thank you to Palante for the great work that you're doing every day fighting landlords who are abusing tenants and making too much money while other people struggling to get by. I'm a partner at Himmelstein, McConnell, Gribben, and Joseph. We're a private firm that represents tenants only. We don't do any evictions because we only represent tenants. So we fight landlords. That's what we do. And represent some co-op shareholders and condo unit owners also, but not landlords. I have a niche within the firm that I do a bulk of the Lama work, although several of us do. But I represent tenants at a dozen or more Lama buildings, and have done so for the last 20 years or so. I'm going to talk tonight about a couple of issues I was asked to address. Primarily, number one, the issue of how do you get succession to a Lama apartment? And number two, the rent increases that Lama tenants are facing these days, and what can be done about it. So to start with the Lama, with the succession issue. So succession under Lama is in most regards similar to rent stabilization with a few differences. So the key, as in rent stabilization, the key requirements to take over an apartment, and when I say take over, I mean to continue living in the apartment when the original applicant and head of household either moves out or passes away. Succession means taking over after that person has gone. The fundamental requirement of every succession case is number one, co-occupancy with the original tenant. Co-occupancy means that both the tenant, and when I say tenant, sometimes there's shareholders because there's Lama co-ops and there's Lama rentals. But both the tenant and the person seeking succession have to have resided together in the apartment as their primary residence for 2 or more years, or 1 year if the person seeking succession is disabled or 62 years or older. So for 2 years or 1 year for 62 or older disabled. 2 years, I'm going to use the 2 years, but 2 years immediately prior to the vacating or the dying of the tenant. So in other words, if my father was the original shareholder or the original tenant of the apartment, and my father died in January 1st, 2022, I would have had to reside in the apartment with him since January, at least since January 1st, 2020. Those are the 2 years. And the second, so the first component, really, the first essential point is that you have to live in the apartment with the tenant. There's always a lot of gray areas and a lot of argument you can make about different things. But if someone comes into my office and says, I want to get succession, and I say, how long have you lived there? And they say, I've never lived there. Then I tell them, go see the door. And, this ain't going to work. You've never lived there. If you moved in 6 months before your dad or mom passes away, 6 months, you're also not going to get succession. Or 3 months or 8 months. If you moved in a year before and you're not disabled or 62, you're not going to get succession. The second component is that there has to be a relationship between the tenant and the person seeking succession. So it has to be either a close family relationship, or what's called a non-traditional family relationship. So, which is similar to rent stabilization. A family relationship, and I have in the materials, and let me just say, there's city Michelamas and state Michelamas. I'm going to talk mostly about city Michelamas because that's what comes into my office the most. But the city Michelamas are supervised by HPD, and the state Michelamas are supervised by DHCR. But the list, I should have it here, of let me just go up here. I'm going to go up here. We're in the 2023 HPD Michelama regulations is part 302, which is way on the top. Obviously, mother, father, sister, brother, daughter, son. Those are all relationships that would entitle you to take over the grandmother, grandfather. I'm just going to see. Stepfather, stepmother. Okay, there we go. Stepmother, stepfather. The only difference between city Michelamas and state Michelamas is DHCR no longer recognizes aunts and uncles, nieces and nephews. So if you're in a state Michelama and the tenant was your uncle or aunt, you might not be able to get succession. So that's the difference. Other than that, the two are similar. I'm still trying to find. I lost it. The actual list. In the materials which Yakai can send to people of the Michelama regulations, you'll see under part 302, you'll see a list of that's not it, but we'll get to that. That's okay.
Okay.
Yeah, it's okay. It's you'll see a list of the actual family. You can also find it online, but I will warn you that the DHCR list of family members, the list online still says aunts and uncles, but the regulations were changed in 2013, and aunts and uncles and nieces and nephews can no longer get succession. So, so those are the two things. And so you have to be a family member. You have to have co-occupied the apartment. If you're not a blood family, family member by blood or an in-law, or stepfather or stepmother, you can come in under what's called a non-traditional family relationship. Now, what does that mean? That means that your relationship is as if it's like you were family, even though you're not. So, for instance, if you live with someone who's not your father, but you have a relationship like he's your father. Maybe he's a cousin or something. Maybe he's a friend who took you in when your parents passed away or something happened. Then you can still get succession. this idea of non-traditional family relationship originally arose in the context of really gay relationships before there was marriage equality. So if you had two men or two women who were together, who were partners and maybe partners their whole life, originally they couldn't, and one died. Originally, they couldn't get succession because there was no right to marry. Um, and so the laws were changed. There was a court decision that said, but they're just like family, even though they're not permitted to get married. And if they can show that their relationship is such that they're like family, you can still take over that apartment. So, but it extends beyond those relationships. As I said, it could be it could be people who are like brothers, or like a mother and a daughter, like a father and a son. And what you have to show for that kind of succession is financial and emotional interdependence. The emotional part is usually photographs. You spend holidays together and birthdays together. You do things that people typically think families would do together. You show photographs, and then the financial interdependence means you're sharing expenses and you're taking care of each other when you need money. And then there's certain legal documents that they look at that are very helpful, and those are things along the lines of having a joint bank account, being named in someone's will, or being named as a beneficiary in someone's life insurance. Um, those are the main ones. Oh, healthcare proxy, having someone's healthcare proxy. So those are all legal documents that show that you have a particularly close relationship. So those are the keys to succession. Um, Let me explain. Then I should say that the third part, which I alluded to, is it has to be your primary residence, and that means you can't be living anywhere else. You have to be living in that apartment as your actual residence, and for more than half the year at least. Um, and you're going to have to prove that primarily by showing tax returns. If you're filing your New York state tax returns at another address, you're probably not, almost definitely not going to get succession. Um, Both the tenant and the person seeking succession. So you have to be filing your taxes at the address. That's the primary proof that that's where you live. Other forms of proof are driver's license, voting, where you vote, and then bank statements and credit card statements. Those are the kinds of evidence that the housing company and eventually HPD or DHCR will look at to determine if you've really been living there, because they don't want people to be pulling a fast one and say they've been living there when they haven't been living there. Uh, 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 and those documents are for the 2 years before the tenant either moved out or died, right? Um, so that's the process. The only other component that differs from rent stabilization is they will look to see if you're on the income affidavits, which are filed every year in the Lama, right? So if your name's not on the income affidavit, that's evidence that you weren't living there. Now, I was fortunate to win a case at the Court of Appeals, which is one of the reasons I get a lot of Lama cases, where I had a client whose name was not, actually, it wasn't that his name wasn't on the income affidavit. His mother hadn't filed an income affidavit for one of the years. And DHCR took the position, well, that means you can't get succession because the regulations actually say you have to be on the income affidavit to get succession. But I argued that all the other evidence shows he was living there, and that they shouldn't apply that very technical rule to prevent him from getting succession. And we won that case, a very big case called Murphy v. DHCR. And so not being on the income affidavit or not having filed the income affidavit is not going to be fatal. But that being said, it's certainly much better to both to file your income affidavits and to be on the income affidavit if you're residing there. Let me talk a little bit about the process of filing for succession. uh, I will say, in terms of the 2 years that you have to be together, or the 1 year, there are some temporary absences that won't count against you. If you're away for 6 months because you're taking care of a sick relative somewhere else, that won't count against you. If you're incarcerated, that doesn't count against you. So there's certain exceptions to having to be living in the apartment. In terms of the actual application process to get succession, and Jakari, I guess you can put up
Okay.
the succession application that you had put up. So this is HPD's application for succession, which the management office should have and give to you if you're ready to seek succession. Now, a lot of people get confused because they think they can seek succession before the tenant has moved or died out, or died or moved out. You can't. There's no succession until the tenant has left, right? So once if your relative passes away or moves out, then you can go down to the management office and get a copy of this application and fill it out. And you see it asks for the name and address, the actual date the person moved out, and sometimes that's complicated because people move out over time. But it's best to try to find a date that's as close approximation as possible when the person moves out, because it's the 2 years prior to that date that's going to be important. So the documents that the housing company or the agency going to look at are going to be the 2 years before the date of move out. So that date's really important. And if you pick the wrong date, you could come up short. So you have to, and let's say you moved in, a year and a half ago, and your sister or whatever, who's the tenant, wants to move out, you'd want to say to her, you got to stay another 6 months, or I won't get succession, right? So when someone passes away, you don't have as much, you don't really have so much control over that relevant time period. But for people moving out, you have some control over it. So you want a date that ensures that you have the 2 years that you need. So then they're going to ask you name your relationship. This is the people residing in the apartment, the name, the relationship to the person seeking succession. And then in section 2, the name of the tenant or the cooperator, which is in a co-op, and then the number of years that the tenant lived in the apartment, and then whether the tenant permanently vacated or died or divorced, I guess divorced and vacated, or moved to a nursing home. That happens a lot. People move to a nursing home. I should say about nursing homes that sometimes people move into a nursing home, but they plan to come back and they hope to come back. Sometimes they do come back. So generally, HPD and DHCR are fairly liberal about that. So that the permanent vacate date can be the date the person dies in the nursing home, and the time that they're in the nursing home doesn't account against you in general. Now, if the person's in nursing over 10 years, that might not be the case. So, but there's a whole issue around nursing homes, which, I could talk about more, but, and then at the bottom, statements have to be truthful, obviously. It's always the case. And then, Jakari, I think you can go to the next document, which is, it also says succession. I think it has the instructions on it. Yeah. Yeah, so this document, I guess, I don't know if you guys are going to send this out to people or, it's available online also, but so this has a whole, it explains how to fill out, pardon me, the application. And if you scroll down, I think there's a list of documents. Yeah, required documents. So if the tenant died, they want a death certificate. They want a birth certificates, a marriage certificates, a proof of the family relationship. If your father, son, or grandfather, grandson, you need to show all the birth certificates to show you actually have that relationship. Or if it's a non-traditional family relationship, there's a lot of other documents. They might not list all those, but that's be the healthcare proxy, joint bank account, some proof that you commingled your finances, and those things. And then the income affidavit, they want you to show the income affidavits for the relevant period. I never understood that because obviously HPD has the income, the housing company has them. So I don't know why they force people to provide them, but they do. And then let's see, scroll down some more. There might be, wait, scroll back up just a little bit. I want to see, there's something here. Okay, what's it? No, stop. You cannot be considered for succession if the occupant of record is only temporarily in the nursing home. So what they're trying to say there, if someone's like in rehab for 6 months, but they're going to come back, then they haven't really permanently vacated. But that gets a little complicated. Okay, you can scroll down. And this is where we keep going. Yeah, this is where we get to the real tough documents. So they want certified tax returns, and there's a form. I could send it to you later, maybe, but and you can get it from HPD or online. There's a form that you can send to the tax department, the state tax department, to get your certified state tax returns. In the employment records, Social Security, Board of Election records, driver's license, insurance, utility bills, credit cards. So that's the whole list. It's very daunting, and it's very, people get really wigged out by having to get all these documents. And one of the things people do a lot is they don't provide enough of the documents, and then you also have people who live a little bit off the grid, or just they're people that don't file taxes, and don't have credit cards, don't have bank accounts, and that becomes a little more complicated. And I think all you can do is explain as best you can in writing to the housing company why you don't have documents. But at the end of the day, they want proof that you live there. And legal office, government agencies and judges, they like legal documents, more than testimony or affidavits. They like legal. They believe that those are more probative, tell that what's really happening. So I'm going to maybe speed up. I feel like I might get bogged down a little. So the way the process works, you fill out the application, you submit your documents, and then the housing company, it's sometimes in conjunction with HPD, and I'm not fully understand how that relationship works sometimes, but the housing company will review the documents, and if they're clear that you're the clear successor, they'll just grant you the succession, and it won't be an issue. And then you just take over the apartment. If it's a co-op apartment, either the original tenant has to either permit a rollover of the equity, a rollover from the prior tenant, or you may have to put down equity, put down a purchase price of the apartment. So that's a whole other issue, but I can't really get into. If the housing company denies your application, then you have a right to appeal either to DHCR or to HPD. So that's mostly what I do. I do these appeals, lots and lots of appeals, and that can drag out for a long time. And if you lose at HPD, you can appeal again to the Supreme Court. So it can it can be the process can take many years in some cases if you have a case that's in a gray area that's not cut and dry. It can take a long time. Um, I'll just say one other quick thing about that, because a lot of people ask me if I get succession. Let's say um, I was living in a three bedroom, and with my with my grandfather and my brother or something, or with my parents in a three-bed room, um, or in a two-bedroom with my parents, and they moved out or they died. Are they going to downsize me? Because there's a lot of concern about that these days. The answer is that they do have the right to downsize you when you get succession. And a lot of my experience has been that they often don't, maybe generally don't, but I think they're starting to do it more. So you have to be aware of that. If the family composition after you get succession no longer meets the occupancy standards for that apartment, you could be downsized. Um, I'll say, and then I want to go talk a little bit about the rent increases. But the big things to remember, apart from the fact you have to live those 2 years together, or 1 year if the person seeking succession is 62 or older or disabled, um, is the clients that come into my office often, um, what happens is the tenant dies, and the child, the son or daughter, just keeps living in the apartment, never does anything, and maybe starts paying the rent in their own name, and the housing company doesn't do anything about it, and this goes on for years. It happens all the time. Um, it People get away with that, and I shouldn't say get away with it, because the housing company knows they're doing it. Everyone knows it. But it is a little, it can be a little, it can be risky. So it's better. It's better to put in the succession application when the time comes to assert your succession rights. Because if you sit on it for too long, you can run into a problem. And the fact that the housing company has been taking your rent, that's not gonna secure the apartment for you necessarily. Um, on the other hand, I'll say that if you are in that situation, that oftentimes I can still you can still win a succession claim. Um, uh, there'll probably be a lot of questions. So I think I touched on the main issues with succession um, in the Mitchell-Lama. I'll say one other thing, particularly with DHCR, is that if the tenant moves out or dies and you don't put in for succession, then particularly in DHCR buildings, I've seen more and more that the landlord or the housing company will turn around and bring a case in housing court. So you want to try to avoid that, and that's why you want to put in your succession application, uh, so that they don't do that. Or even if they do, you can at least go into court and say, I have a succession application that's pending at the DHCR. But they seem to jump the gun, those housing court cases. Let me talk a little bit about, I'm trying to get my other computer up, rent increases. So we're seeing a lot of rent increases at Mitchell-Lama's these days. I'm seeing them, 10%, 15, 16, really high increases. Sometimes because there hasn't been one in a long time. And sometimes also because they need to do capital improvements, but it's hitting tenants very hard. I understand that. I had one at Tracy Towers in the Bronx that I tried to help with. Um, we put in a lot of opposition, but they still issued the order increasing the rent. Um, the let me see what I have here. How do I put this here? Uh,
While David is looking for that, I just wanted to mention that we do have the Q&A that will be starting soon.
yeah, very
If you have a
soon.
question, please feel free to ask it there so we can answer it.
Yeah, let me just find in the Mitchell Lama, and these are the HPD regulations at part 3-10, and it's the PDF says 2023 HPD Mitchell Lama regulations. I'm going to try to find 3-10. It lays out the process for the rent increases. Essentially, the process is that the owner has to file a petition with HPD, and the petition has to then be sent to all of the tenants. Everyone should get a copy of the application for a rent increase, and it will include financial statements from the owner and an explanation of why they need to increase the rent. And that's then followed by a hearing run by HPD, where all tenants have an opportunity to come out and testify, and also to submit written opposition to the application. A key part of fighting the rent increase application is hiring your own accountant. The tenants collectively, the tenant association can hire their own accountant to review the application and see if there's problems with it. Mitchell Lama program pays the cost of that account. I think it's up to $6,000 for the accountant. So that's really important. I will say I've been having a problem. My client's been having a problem finding accountants. So I don't know. We're going to find someone to learn this area or something. I'm not sure what the problem is, but so then there's a hearing. Your accountant can put in opposition. You can put in opposition. And there's a hearing, and then HPD makes a decision on the increase, which is based on the cost of running the building. You know, that's what it is. Um, um, uh, there is a provision that says that HPD can deny the application if the owner is not maintaining the building, maintaining essential services. I have found that HPD doesn't do it, hasn't been following that. So even in buildings where essential services are not being maintained, they're still granting these rent increases. Political problem and a financial problem the city has to find a way to avoid these big increases. Um, but the other thing, once HPD does grant, if it grants the increase, then you can file what's called an Article 78 in Supreme Court challenging that decision. But you have to do that within 4 months of the rent increase order being issued. So you have to jump on that, and the court could reverse it, but not likely, because the court's going to give a lot of deference to the agency. So it's a very difficult thing to fight, and I think, as I'm sure Palante knows very well, that it's a legal fight, and it's very much a political fight. I think it's something that the elected officials have to get. I think the elected officials have to do a better job protecting the tenants when it comes to these rent increases, because um, strictly legally speaking, there may not be a good way to beat them. We have gotten some reduced by pointing out problems in the application. We've gotten some reduced in the past, but I don't know that we've gotten any completely denied altogether. But it's section 310 of the Mitchell Lama regulations. So that's the rent increase. So I think, so we have 20 minutes or so. We can go over some. I'll stay longer if we need to. And maybe it's time to open it to questions.
Yeah, we can open questions up since we have a few. Thank you, David, for presenting. So we're going to start the Q&A. So the first question is, what if the board refused my succession even though my dad passed and I've been living there my whole life?
Yeah, so if the housing company denies the succession, you have a right to appeal to HPD if it's a city, Mitchell-Lama, or DHCR if it's a state Mitchell-Lama. You have a right to file your appeal within 30 days of the denial, but they tend to be so far flexible about that. If you miss the deadline, they may still hear the appeal. And look, it goes without saying these things are easier to do with an attorney, but if you have to pay for an attorney, it can get costly. And finding free attorneys to do these kinds of appeals, I don't know how easy that is. It might not be easy, but but you do have a right to appeal and explain to either HPD or DHCR why the housing company just got it wrong, which they do. They do get it wrong. And here's the most important thing, really, I can tell you, and one of the reasons I have so many appeals, unlike an appeal in court, it's very different. In an administrative appeal, and at least in these administrative appeals, you can submit additional evidence on your appeal. So often what happens is a tenant or someone seeking succession, they try to do their application alone. They don't quite understand all the rules. They don't put in enough documents. The application gets denied, and then they come to an attorney or to a tenant advocate or someone to help them, and and they get a lot more documents, on the appeal. So in this type of appeal, the agency, HPD or DCR, will look at more documents. So maybe you didn't put in all of your tax returns, or maybe you didn't put in your voting. Maybe there's something missing, or maybe there were documents that made it look like you didn't live there, but you had an explanation. So anyway, that's the answer is, yeah, you can win on appeal. In a lot of cases, they do get denied and then later won on appeal.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, how do I fight increases? I don't agree with them, and many tenants don't as well. And who do I file increase complaints to?
Yeah, so there's a process on these increases. There's a hearing. They're required to have a hearing. And at the hearing, you're permitted to testify. And if you can't physically get to the hearing, you're permitted to submit opposition to the written opposition to the rent increase. So that's the way you can do it. You have to be part of the process, and get your neighbors to be part of the process also. I mean, the strength in numbers. That's really how you do anything in this city, in the world, right? The strength in numbers. You got to organize and get lots of people out to talk about how the building's not being kept up, they're not doing the repairs, they're not providing essential services. And then you got to go out and find an accountant also to look at the application. It's tricky stuff. It's not easy. It's not easy stuff. That's why you need an expert to look at the application. So I think that's my best answer. And then political pressure. I mean, also all the tenants is, and I think that the Mitchell-Lama coalition is, from what I understand, and I might be wrong, I hope I am wrong, but when I understand the Mitchell-Lama coalition, which existed, has fallen in a little bit of disrepair, not quite as strong maybe as it was, but all of the Mitchell-Lamas need to come together, or the tenants associations of all the Mitchell-Lamas come together and work together to fight these increases, because they're really hurting people.
Thank you. The next question is, which I think you answered, but if I don't have all documents, will I be denied or can I provide another form of document?
Yeah, I mean, if you don't have, if you look, if you don't have one kind of document, you can try to find another kind of document. Yeah, and you can also provide affidavits, even though that's not on the list. If you have affidavits or statements, it can even be just a statement that's notarized, right? Um, I think that they have some value if you don't have documents. And when I say statements, I mean neighbors who say I've seen you in the apartment every day for the last 2 years, or twice a week. I see you coming in and out. I know that's where you live. Blah 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 blah. Details about why you proving that you actually live there. Any missing documents, you should have an explanation for. If you didn't file taxes, you should explain. My income was too low to file taxes. That happens. If you don't have a driver's license, I don't know. I don't drive. I don't need a driver's license. So you could put it in a state ID though. If you don't vote, then I don't want to talk to you if you don't vote.
Mhm.
No, I mean, you got to vote. It's important. But yeah, if you don't have certain documents, you can try to find other documents. But unfortunately, or just the way it is with the legal system, official documents are given the highest value in this legal system. I think it's I think it's a bit of a discriminatory aspect to it, because there are people that are not as document rich as others. The people that just don't have as many documents, just the way they live. Some people work off the books or whatever. Whatever it is, just don't. So there is a discriminatory aspect to it, I think.
Mhm.
But that's the way it is. So you got to do your best, and you can put it in affidavits too. But anyway.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, what is the difference between the Lama and rent stabilization?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of succession, I mean, strictly speaking, in terms of succession, the rules are pretty similar. Um, HPD, at least in the city Michelamas, they still recognize aunts and uncles and nieces and nephews. In rent stabilization, they don't at all. Um, in Michelama, you have the income affidavits. So they do look at those. Uh, they're not fatal if they weren't filed, but they do look at them. They do play a role, and if you're better if you're on them. So that's a difference. I guess the question was about succession, but I don't know if it was a larger question about the difference. I mean, Michelama is for low and moderate income people, so there's income restrictions coming into a Michelama building, right? The restrictions on income. Once you're in the building, once you get in, there really aren't income restrictions. I think they're still in the regulations, but they've never ever been enforced. And they're not. They don't kick people out for being over income. What they do is they charge you more. They charge you a surcharge. Yeah, they charge you a surcharge if your income goes up after you moved in. So the income cap is only for getting into the program. Rent stabilization has there's no income cap. Anybody, you can make any amount of income and live in rent stabilized building. That's a misunderstanding about the program. The program is meant to keep rents down. It's not geared specifically low income people, although it does benefit low income people a lot.
Mhm. Okay. The next question. So can I be evicted unless, wait, so I can't be evicted unless court judge orders?
Yes, correct. You cannot be evicted unless the court orders it.
Okay.
That's correct.
Right. The next question is, if applying for succession, does the state co-op have the right to take away your parking space?
Well, that's a great question. A really good question. Question is, do I know the answer? I think what I've seen, no, what I have seen, and I haven't challenged it, is that yes, the parking space does not necessarily go with the succession. I believe, I'm not 100% certain on it. I believe there may be differences between buildings because there are some differences between housing companies. So certainly it's possible that you could get succession and they'd also give you the parking space as well. But overall, my understanding is that you don't automatically get the parking space when you inherit the apartment.
Okay, the next question is, are there attorneys that specialize in tenant harassment and retaliation cases? Does those cases ever go to trial? Landlords seem to drag them out for years. Does that reduce the likelihood of lawyers taking cases for specific landlords?
That's an interesting one.
Mhm.
Um, Look, bunch of there's a lot of tenant attorneys in the city. I say, because I'm completely objective, that my firm is the top private tenant side firm in the city. Although there are others that are very good. Um, as far as harassment cases, um, harassment and retaliation cases, yeah, I'd say they're hard to win for sure. There have been wins. There have been wins for sure, but I think they are hard to win. So it might be hard. I mean, you could always find an attorney to take a case if you pay them. So that's not going to be a problem if you pay the attorney. But whether it's whether it's winnable and how much it will cost to win, and what you get back from it. One of the problems with harassment cases, I believe they changed, they amended the law so a tenant can get some kind of compensation. You can get compensation on them, but whether the compensation is going to be worth the legal fees, and you may also get your legal fees back, but that's not guaranteed. You don't always. So I think the best I can say is that those are tough cases. There are attorneys that will handle them. I would handle them. I've handled them for sure. But they're tough cases, and I don't think there've been a lot of great decisions out of the courts on harassment and retaliation. There've been some, but not a lot. Initially, judges didn't seem to want to rule in favor of tenants at all on harassment. But in the last couple of years, I've seen more good decisions. Um, but that's a hard case to win.
Mhm. Okay, the next question is, can a letter my dad written for me to be removed from the lease be held against me with having overwhelming evidence that I lived there for the past 2 years?
That's a good one. So the letter, I want to understand if the letter was
So the
asking to remove him from the
Yeah,
lease.
so the letter her dad wrote was asking for her to be removed, but she's saying she's been living there for the 2 years, I guess, to apply for succession or to try. I guess I don't know. He's trying to get her out or something, some type of reason. I'm not really. She said, "Would it help
Yeah,
if I write a personal letter to the judge to explain that letter that her father wrote?" Like, I guess she's against that letter.
yeah, yeah. I mean, simply writing a letter for the tenant simply to write a letter asking you to be removed. It depends what else the letter said. If the letter said you need to remove my daughter because she doesn't live here, that's a problem, and you're going to have to counter it somehow. But if the letter just says I want my daughter removed from the lease, that doesn't mean that's not saying that you don't live there.
Right.
So the fact that the tenant doesn't want you to take over, the fact that a tenant doesn't want you to take over a lease has no legal bearing. that has no legal value or bearing is that's doesn't they that doesn't matter whether they want you or don't want. In fact, it doesn't matter if they want you to take over the lease. Sometimes you have people that leave the apartment to the tenant in their will, but that's meaningless. That's not how succession works. You can't leave an apartment, you can't leave a Mitchell Lama apartment or a rent stabilized apartment to somebody in your will. You have to go through this process. So yeah, I would say the answer is if there's any evidence of any kind that's bad for you, you should explain it. Yeah, you should write something to the judge explaining the evidence. You always want to rebut any evidence that looks bad for you. But I haven't seen the letter. But if all it was is him saying I don't want her on the lease, then it shouldn't hurt you. You may still want to address it. Yeah, we didn't have a good relationship or whatever, whatever. But that doesn't mean you weren't living there.
Mhm. Okay. The next question is, my landlord sent me a new lease, but I have my rent frozen because of damages on my apartment. Do they have the right to raise my rent, or does my rent still, or will my rent still be frozen?
So I guess the question is it frozen because of is this a Mitchell Lama apartment?
I mean, not sure. Um, the person that asked that, can you let us know if it's a Michelama apartment? But I think the general question, I guess, if she has I guess she want a rent reduction, or
Yeah, it sounds like a rent reduction, but
yeah,
in Mitchell Lama they don't have that. That's
right.
only
So
rent
she must,
stabilization. So
right.
yeah, if there's a rent reduction order
Hmm.
on the apartment and it hasn't been lifted, which requires the owner applying to have it lifted and then it being granted. If the rent reduction is still in effect, no, the landlord cannot increase your rent. He can only increase your rent after the rent reduction is lifted.
Hmm.
It's called a rent restoration. And for a landlord to get a rent restoration, he has to apply to the DACR. He has to prove that the whatever conditions gave rise to the rent reduction have been fixed, right? Um, and then the DHCR has to issue an order restoring the rent, and then he can bring the rent back up to what it would have been, but he can't go back and get the increases he lost.
Hmm.
I mean, he can get going forward, he can get those increases, but he can't go back and collect any money from back beforehand.
Right,
I hope that answers.
right. Um, okay, that seems to have been the last question. Um,
All right.
yeah. Dave,
Well,
want to add anything else you want to say?
I think we covered what we came to cover. I want to say, well,
Oh,
well, yeah, you have something else,
yes. So
Jakari?
the person we were talking, the person who asked a question about the letter being written, she said the reason my dad wrote the letter was because he was trying to get Section 8. But I mean, I think you told like it doesn't really matter what.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, take her off the lease because he's trying to get fiction. Yeah, yeah. Again, the only issues are were you really living there or not living,
For those years.
you know, for those years. I mean, look, I mean, it does. Um, it raises a little bit of a related question, so I'll just say it. Some people, if you're on SCREE, which is Senior Citizen Rent Increase Exemption, it freezes your rent because of your income. If the tenant is on SCREE, then but the tenant is not listing you, the person who wants succession on their SCREE form, that can be used against you. So you have to be careful about that. Sometimes people on SCREE, but they don't list their their daughter because their daughter's bringing in income that would knock them off of SCREE. But that can become a problem later if when the daughter tries to seek succession. So then the owner can come forward and say, wait a second, she wasn't living there because she wasn't on the street. My experience has been that's not necessarily fatal, but it's not a good piece of evidence.
Okay.
Yeah, so I mean, look, if people have additional follow-up questions, you could get them to Jakari or Palante, and they can forward them to me, and I'll do my best to answer them. I sent Jakari. I don't know if you're going to share the materials with your participants, but that's there. The Mitchell-Lama regulations are there, and they're also available online. Like, it's a little tricky finding them, to be perfectly honest with you. Um, uh, and
Mhm.
then I'll just again thank you to Jakari, thank you to Palante, is doing amazing work, and to anybody, everybody who's advocating for tenants. Keep up the fight. It never ends. There's no rest for the weary, and there's no justice without struggle, as Frederick Douglass said.
Yeah.
You got to keep keep fighting every day, and we sometimes we win, and that's good. Not
Mhm.
always, but sometimes we do. So, and I
Yeah.
thank you very much for having me. It's really a great
Yeah.
pleasure.
Okay, yes. Thank you, David, so much for providing us with all your knowledge on succession rights and the rent increases for the Mitchell-Lama tenants. And thank you for answering each tenant or attendee's question in such great detail. If anyone on this webinar needs further assistance, please, contact Palante, or I'm gonna have David give his firm's, like I guess, main number. If you want, David, you could give
Yeah,
me.
absolutely, absolutely. You can reach us at 212-349-3000. That's 212-349-3000. And you can also always find us, if you remember the name Himmelstein McConnell, you can Google that Himmelstein McConnell, and you can find us pretty quickly on the Google. You can put in my name, and I come up pretty quickly also on the Google. So you can also find us that way.
Mm,
And yeah, let us know if we can help out.
yeah.